The snow had not yet fallen, but the air was a knife, thin and exacting, slicing through linen and flesh as though it sought out bone. It was the kind of cold that warned, not with sound but with stillness, a held breath before the descent. Beneath a sky the color of lead, the city's gate let out a groan, not like metal, but like something wounded. Hinges long rusted, wood swollen from months of unrelenting damp, and through it came the wagon. Its wheels turned with a sluggish ache, sinking into the muck of thawing frost and the waste of the previous days, straw, rot, and the refuse of those too weak to carry burdens back home. The driver wore no colors. Only a wax cloak, stitched at the shoulders, darkened with soot and stiffened with old grease. He smelled of burnt tallow, wet wool, and sheep's fat gone rancid. Her hands trembled as she held out a ring, dulled and bent at the edges, the imprint of her marriage still faintly pressed into the metal. Her son stood beside her, thin, hollow. The white of his robe was yellowed at the sleeves, his fingers red with cold. He coughed into his sleeve, blood, thick and dark, staining linen already stiff with old stains. It stank of vinegar from spoiled wine, the sour tang of unwashed skin, and the 6-week rot of meat left too long in shadow. Even the rats moved slowly now, bloated on refuse too corrupted for humans to touch. Where once he gave sermons beneath vaulted arches, now he whispered psalms in exchange for stale crusts. He watched her trade the last thing his father had given her for a strip of pig-ass fat, slick with gray oil and time. The saints carved into its doors wore hollow eyes and smiles that had never truly meant peace. Inside, the relics remained, finger bones, pieces of cloth, old nails wrapped in velvet, but the priests no longer spoke of miracles. The silence of the church echoed the silence of the grave. Somewhere a man whispered a prayer. Somewhere else a child sang quietly to herself, a song her mother used to hum while preparing herbs that no longer grew. His face was not hidden, but it may as well have been carved from bark, unmoved, weathered, unreadable. The people saw it. None of them flinched. He did not cry. Not even when the dark came. That had gone out of him weeks ago. Shadows bent across the cobbles as trades continued beneath their reach. A man gave up his boots for a pouch of flour spoiled with mildew. A child sold her father his prayer book for a broth made from bones that did not smell of cow or pig. He did not speak. His goods did. Once there had been apples stacked in pyramids, ribbons strung from stalls, coins clinking in open palms. The Lord is my shepherd, but there were no pastures left. He only clutched the slab of fat in his small hands, and in his eyes, for a moment, there was something like reverence. Somewhere a dog barked once and then went silent. Somewhere else a pot boiled over, and the steam curled like incense toward a god who had long since closed his ears. Or shame, they were the same now. He took what he was given. He gave what he had. Now, the only music was the soft crunch of frost beneath boots and the slow breathing of those who had come to barter with pieces of their past. There was no feast, only the ritual of enduring. The first lid lifted revealed salted fish bloated, split, their silver scales dulled to gray, their bellies open like mouths caught mid-scream. Another sack was untied, revealing grain mottled with tiny black dots, weevils. They scattered like ash across the cobbles. The merchant made no apology. The city, what remained of it, watched with the famished eyes of the barely alive. The sun had not been seen in days, only hinted at behind woolen skies. A bell rang faintly from the eastern gate, a single strike, long and thin, like a nail driven into wood. Faces peered from warped doorways, their shapes wrapped in cloaks once dyed with joy, but now dulled by time and filth. Children leaned out, lips cracked, cheeks red with wineburn, their eyes ancient from hunger. One boy reached out instinctively and was pulled back by his mother before his shadow touched the merchant S-cart. Hope had become a dangerous thing, but still they hoped. The marketplace, long stripped of its music, was now a graveyard of trade. A woman approached, the baker's widow. She no longer wore black. In this place grief had no color. He said nothing. Across the square a friar moved through the crowd. He wore the vestments of a church that could no longer feed its flock. He murmured one now, beneath his breath, not for salvation but for memory. The air was foul, but they had stopped noticing. And above it all the cathedral loomed. Its stones were silent. Still, life clung to the city with teeth. Bartered, bitten, chewed raw, and swallowed. As dusk fell, it came like a shroud across the rooftops. Another merchant had arrived. New rot, new hope. The crowd shifted, sensing motion in the wind. Desperation had a sound, a tightening in the throat, a creak of boots, the hush that preceded movement. High above it all, a crow landed on the spire. It cocked its head once, then began to pick at something soft in its beak flesh, too pale for certainty. What could shock the starved? What could move those who had buried neighbors in unmarked graves just to make room for sleep? The marketplace did not close. Lanterns were lit, their flames wavering in the wind like the last gasps of old men. The merchant said nothing. By torchlight, the baker's widow led her son home. She did not speak. He did not ask what she had lost. Night fell fully, and the city exhaled, a sigh that moved through chimney cracks and broken shutters. The bells did not ring again that night. But in the west, on the road beyond the frozen fields, torchlight flickered in a slow line. More wagons, more silence, more trade. They were coming, as they always did. And in their wagons would be more answers carved from famine, salted hide, yellowed grain, sour wine, and spoiled dreams. But someone, somewhere, would trade for it. Not because it was good, but because it was what remained Dot, and so the wheel turned Dot, and beneath the spire, the crow cried again, its call sharp and sudden, like a warning long overdue. Tomorrow would be colder, and the hunger would not sleep. Before the rot, there were gardens, not the gardens of kings, not the kind, watered with silver and praised in song, but humble ones. Monks with dirt under their nails, sisters who sang as they pruned the vines. The clatter of clay pots and the scent of rosemary drifting through stone cloisters. There had been rows of leeks, heads of cabbage that curled like green prayers, strawberries hidden beneath leaves waiting for small hands. But now the earth had hardened, cracked beneath months of frost and neglect. The convent orchard stood silent, its trees bare and sullen, the soil like fired clay beneath the weight of boots that no longer cared to tread gently. Barrels lay broken, their metal hoops rusted to powder, their wood hollowed by rain and rats. Weeds crawled where roots once bore sweetness, Dot, and so the morning came without warmth. A girl moved through the silence, barefoot across the flagstones of the almshouse, her breath rising in thin clouds, her steps too light for the weight she bore. A sack of carrots rotted on her back, the mold bloomed across their skins like lace. Her fingers were wrapped in strips of old linen, stained with grease, bruises, and burns. The marks of kitchens where nothing was wasted and no one was spared. The storeroom swallowed her. Damp seeped from the stone walls, the kind that never dried, not even in summer. It coated the beams in mildew, clung to the sacks piled high with barley, grain swollen with moisture, teeming with worms. She did not flinch. She only moved, silently, gently, as one might tend the dying. Nothing was thrown away, not here. Not anymore. She peeled back the lid of a crate, its hinges shrieking like an old man waking from troubled sleep. Inside, meat, or what was once meat. Now it lay slick, bloated, painted with mold the color of sky and bone. The smell rose like a warning, but her master had buyers. He always had buyers. The tanners would boil it for glue, the alchemists would. Mash it into salves, and the mothers, the ones with silence in their eyes, would trade for it in quiet corners. They would slice it fine, boil it twice, mix it with bark and sage, and pour the broth down their children's throats, hoping the warmth would trick the body into believing it was something in the shadow of the bell tower. The bartering began. It was not loud. Hunger did not shout. It whispered. In Latin, in Low German, in half-remembered tongues from places long buried beneath plague and war, a handful of cloves, once a treasure carried across seas, now bought a single egg, pale and hairline cracked. A monk's belt, the buckle still marked with the seal of the abbey, fetched a bottle of vinegar sharp enough to burn the nose, the bishop's page, just 14. His tunic too short, his eyes too large, sold something less visible. Bits of dignity traded in alleyways behind the scriptorium. In return, he received a cloth bundle of apples, blackened and soft, their skins split like wounds. He did not cry. He only ate. Inside the cathedral, the candles still flickered. They melted slowly, bleeding wax like old saints. The choir still sang, but the incense was no longer enough. It mixed with the smell of rot and sweat, the thick tang of unwashed bodies, and something deeper, something that clung not to skin, but to faith. At Vespers, the people still knelt. Their voices rose in fractured harmony, Latin syllables falling like cold rain against stone. But in their mouths, the taste was wrong. The breath of the city was inside them now. They swallowed hunger with their prayers. The kitchen girl returned from the storeroom. She moved toward the hearth. A low fire, barely alive, on the table. Lay a single dried plum, wrinkled and dark. She picked it up with trembling fingers. She did not eat it. She pressed it to her lips. She held it there. Like a relic she remembered once. Not a feast, not even a supper, just a day when her mother had let her have a whole plum to herself. It had been warm, split open by sun. Its juice had run down her chin, and her laughter had echoed across the cloister walls. Now, she let the dried fruit soften against her breath. That was enough. Outside, the bells tolled 1, 2. Each note rang hollow, bouncing off rooftops and broken shutters. Echoing down alleyways slick with night, the people heard them and crossed themselves, out of habit, perhaps, or superstition, not for salvation. Not for joy, but for memory. They remembered what bread used to taste like. They remembered the first time they ever went hungry, not knowing it would become their every day. They remembered laughter, and they crossed themselves for that. Some still believed. Others pretended. But all of them remembered. And in the highest tower, above the rot and the bargaining and the whispered Latin, a single light still burned behind a slit window. A sister, her face lined, her fingers stained with wax and ash, scribbled prayers into a torn manuscript. Her ink was made from soot and spit. Her words were crooked. But she wrote them anyway, because someone, somewhere, might read them someday. And know they had survived, even if survival meant trading faith for flour, or childhood for broth made from shoes. Even if it meant pressing fruit to lips and not biting. The city below her sagged under the weight of absence, of what was gone, of what would not return. But still the girl stirred the pot. Still the friar whispered his prayer. Still the bells rang out, because that is what cities do when they die slowly. They pretend, they bargain, they remember, and they wait. Wait for snow. Wait for spring. Wait for the taste of sweetness, even if it is only imagined. The plum in the girl's hand had gone warm. She set it down, untouched. And in the silence that followed, the fire gave a low pop, a sound, so soft it might have been mistaken for a sigh. The next chapter was already coming. Not with mercy. But with motion. And the bells would ring again. The stables had become a market, not the kind with music, or laughter, or coins that clinked in clean hands. No, this was a market of shadows, lit by lanterns that sputtered with more smoke than flame, thick with the stink of dung, wet straw, and the breath of beasts too tired to live, too stubborn to die. Their eyes were wide, glassy. Their sides rose and fell with effort. Some had gone still, their legs curled under them like broken chairs, but still men came, not merchants. Not farmers. These were men with cracked lips and red eyes, blistered palms wrapped in cloth once used for blessing. They crouched in the corners behind hay bales and muck, speaking in low tones, not because they feared the law, but because the things they traded should not have had names. A slab of meat, green at the edges, wrapped in a torn sermon page that still bore the words, "Give us this day." A wheel of cheese, if it could be called that, cracked through the center, seeping pale fluid, its belly crawling with maggots. The seller did not hide them. He pointed proudly. Medicinal, for poultices, they draw the rot. And indeed, buckets sat nearby, already half filled with larvae, scooped and sold by weight, more precious than flour, for wounds, for infections. For profit, outside, the wind clawed at the stable doors, howling like a widow at a locked gate. And in some forgotten stall, nearly buried in straw, a child sang, a melody without tune, a lullaby of nonsense and need. Its only rhyme was hunger. The Baron's steward arrived near dusk. He wore sable, thick and dark, the kind taken from animals bred in cages. His boots shone with polish no one had seen in months. His hands were soft, his nose pinched, not from disgust, but from habit. Arrogance made flesh. He did not barter. He offered silver. Cold and clean, but not for grain. Not for blankets? No, for things no honest man would name aloud, a tooth still in the root, a lock of hair from a girl not yet bled, a bone sawn clean and boiled for its marrow. What he wanted was memory, and he paid well for those willing to forget. It was not hunger that made men cruel. It was remembrance of roasted boars, turned on spits before crowds of laughing nobles, of pastries shaped like doves, sweet with almond, and dates, of wine poured not in sips but in rivers. Those memories poisoned the soul. They made the present unbearable. They made cruelty just another form of nostalgia. In the chapel, a single candle flickered beside the reliquary, a box of bones and promises. The priest was thin now, more robed than man, and his voice trembled with each psalm. He no longer offered hope, only ashes. Ashes for the skin, ashes for the bread. Ashes to remember that all things fall, but even ashes had value. In the back pews, behind the veil of incense, the perfumer's widow waited. Her eyes were sharp. Her wares sharper, she brewed rice wine in secret, hidden in the basins once used to mix oils for the anointing of kings. Now her bottles came wrapped in painted cloth, roses, lilac, vines of gold. She called it medicine, and for many, it was a medicine for forgetting, for sleeping without dreaming, for swallowing the memory of children's laughter turned thin and brittle. She did not sell to the poor, but the priest did. He bought with the coins left in the offering plate. With ash, he paid her. A sacred exchange. No one spoke of it. The city walls groaned in the night, not from siege, but from frost. It bit into the stone, climbed between the bricks, cracked the mortar with quiet fury. Outside the gates, the refugees burned their shoes. One child clutched the melted sole of his father's boot as it burned, the smell bitter, sharp, almost sweet. Inside, the highborn lit incense over their latrines, not for piety, but to mask the truth of what they consumed and what they could no longer cleanse. Even waste had become a performance. The city was rotting from the inside, but the perfumed smoke still rose like a lie whispered to heaven. Every bowl of soup held a story that was false. Every crust of bread was paid for in silence, or blood, or something worse. In a courtyard no one tended anymore, a place once used for the winter market, a young girl stumbled upon a pomegranate. Its skin was bruised, cracked down one side. Its crown broken, she picked it up as if it might vanish, and then, slowly, she knelt. Her hands trembled as she split it open. The seeds inside blackened, soft, bled red onto her fingers. The juice clung to her nails like guilt. She did not eat it. She only stared. As if the fruit had spoken, as if it had offered something too sacred for her to accept. Above, the tower bell struck 7. It had once meant feast. Mass. The beginning of music. Now, it marked nothing, only the passing of time, like a breath across a mirror. A reminder that someone, somewhere, still counted the hours. That the city had not yet forgotten how to measure its own suffering. In the silence that followed, even the rats paused. Their claws rested on stone. Their eyes blinked slowly, reverent almost. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Hunger, like holiness, demands a certain stillness, and so the city sat in that moment. In its rot. In its memory. In its unbearable truth. Tomorrow, the stables would fill again, the stew would be stirred, the candles would burn, but tonight, just for a breath, there was only the echo of a child's song, the taste of rot on a girl's tongue, and the silver coin that changed hands for something never named. The market had closed, and the dark had won. The candlelight trembled. Not from breeze, there was none, but from breath. Cold, shallow, Uncertain. The cellar door creaked open, wooden stairs groaned under her weight. Each step down was a surrender. One hand brushed the stone wall, slick with damp. The other clutched a cloth bundle, yesterday's bread, once golden, now blackened and soft, its center bloated with mold like a wound turned inward. She laid it down beside the herring, salted long ago, its skin split with brine blisters, its eye clouded and shriveled. Then she sat. Not to eat, not to rest. Just to be still. This was not a larder. It was a tomb, a place where food came to rot. A room built not for storing life, but for holding on to what was dying. The air tasted sour, the breath of pears long collapsed in their crates. Apples turned to paste, grain eaten from within. Wormholes like constellations mapped across every sack, a galaxy of loss, but it was all they had. Above her, the house stirred. The muffled sound of pacing feet, coughs stitched with panic. Someone whispering a prayer too old for Latin. The youngest daughter hadn't eaten in 2 days. The father, once a scribe, his fingers ink-stained and sure, had traded his last pot of writing ink for a single leak. A withered thing, more root than vegetable. The man who accepted the trade didn't smile. No one smiled anymore. Least of all the scribe, who wept when he handed it over, whispering something about a charter he never finished. In the marketplace, boys sold soup. But this was no broth of meat or marrow. No, this soup came from pots that had once boiled. Bones for parchment glue. The gelatin was gone, long scraped. Now the pots were filled with water and hope. One boy stirred his slowly, watching bits of bark float beside something green, herbs scraped from the monastery garden. He didn't know what they were, didn't care if they healed or harmed. His customers didn't ask. Hunger does not reason. Behind the guild hall, men gathered, not to work but to sharpen knives. The sound was relentless. Stone against metal, again and again, not for hunting, not for cutting bread. These blades were for barter, iron for salt, blood for oil, memory for stew. A mason carved a lion's head from limestone, a commission for the bishop's tomb. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's noon. His belly snarled like the beast he carved. Still, he worked, because the bishop paid in candles, and a candle could buy broth, or rice, or if you were very lucky, warmth. Back in the cellar, the woman struck flint. A new candle flared to life, its flame too bright in this forgotten place. The smoke coiled up into the wooden rafters, curling like incense in a chapel. Softening the scent of rot, she moved slowly, deliberately, from a cedar chest in the corner, now gnawed at the base. She pulled something wrapped in linen and timed. Her wedding dress, once ivory, it had turned yellow at the edges. The silk, stiff and brittle. Buttons dulled with tarnish, lace frayed into cobwebs. She held it up as though it might disappear. Tomorrow she would sell it. For onions, if she was lucky. She did not cry, not because she was strong, but because tears had become extravagant. A waste of salt, a rat scurried across the beam above her, fat, fast, confident. She did not flinch. She only watched it, then bowed her head and whispered something, not in the tongue of the bishop or the merchant or the magistrate. But in the voice of her grandmother, a prayer, or maybe a spell, words shaped by hands that once knew herbs by scent and stars by name, a charm for health. A plea for dignity, a song for survival, not to thrive, not anymore. That language had died. This was a song to endure. The bread beside her, sour, soft, laced with veins of blue, would feed her daughter. She would cut around the worst of it, toast it over the fire until it blackened further. Tell the girl it was just different. Now, not bad, just different. Upstairs, the girl cried out. The mother did not run. She did not even rise. She only closed her eyes and said, "Enough. For now." And for tonight, that would be true. The girl would eat. The cellar door would close. The candle would burn low. No feast. No comfort, but still something passed from mother to child. Not food, but will. Above them, frost crept along the window panes. The moon hung pale and bored in the sky, watching a city wilt from inside its own skin. In the distance, bells rang. Not for mass. Not for marriage, But to mark curfew. Another day gone. Another page burned. And in the silence that followed you could almost hear the dress sigh, the last breath of a life once imagined, now folded, buttoned, and bargained for in onions. Dawn seeped through the arrow slits of the guardhouse like pale blood. A single shaft of light cut across the cold stone floor, illuminating flecks of dust that danced in slow circles. The sentry stood motionless, one gaunted hand resting on the sill, the other holding a slab of salted ox tongue so old it cracked like bark beneath his teeth. He did not taste it. Taste had long since abandoned this place, replaced by a requirement as urgent as breath. Sustenance. Below him, the city spread like a wound. Roofs sagged under frost, their tiles chipped and slick. Chimneys stood silent, a promise of warmth unfulfilled. Empty streets wound between shuttered doorways, their arches bowed under the weight of abandonment. Here and there, a shutter creaked an echo of movement, of a life too fragile to endure daylight. Beneath the battlements, in the narrow alley where the guard's watch met the world beyond the wall, the butchers had opened shop. But these were not the butcheries of festivals and feast days. No wine-dark oxen hung waiting for celebration. Instead, rough-hewn tables bore the remains of what could still be called meat, horsehide boiled down to a grisly jelly, its color the same as burned bone. Bird bones ground to powder, sold as ersatz porridge. Even cats' once beloved companions flayed and portioned, their skins draped over the stalls like ragged banners. No one stopped to ask what stew had simmered in their pots. It simply was in the gloom of one narrow stall, a boy with one shoe huddled against the wall. He counted the coins in his palm, 3 small bronzes, Byzantine pennies chipped and near worthless. He knew they would buy almost nothing. Yet, when the merchant lifted a string of dried fish-head skulls bleached by wind, he offered the lot. The merchant sneered, red-rimmed eyes flashing with contempt, but he took the coins. Trade was not noble here. It was survival dressed in shadow. Inside the great hall, the steward presided over a different form of commerce. The chamber reeked of mold and old parchment. The steward's ledger lay open on a table scarred by spilled ink and the gnawing of mice. His quill scratched at the page, but the ink had frozen in its pot, so he must warm each dip by cupping his hands around it, breath swirling like smoke. Quills snapped under his stiff fingers. Each break felt like another piece of the world fracturing. Beyond the steward's chamber, behind doors that once marked judgment or banquet, the baron retreated further into his chambers. Rumor spoke of honeyed wine and dried rose petals, his sole sustenance, drunk as though he were a cleric observing a self-imposed fast. He claimed piety, but no one believed his devotion was anything but the indulgence of memory, of times when his halls were full of laughter, the tables groaning under boars' legs and sweetmeats shaped like doves. He starved himself in the name of sacrifice. Yet the sacrifice was only for those he served, not for himself. In the servants' quarters, a young girl hammered stale bread into crumbs. Her blows rang through the narrow space, each crack of crust a note in a requiem for innocence. She mixed the crumbs with dollops of grease scraped from the kitchen hearth and sprigs of lavender plucked from the solitary windowsill garden. The scent was perfumed, almost gentle, but the crumbs remained tainted with rot. She shaped them into biscuits, arranging them on a pewter plate for the lady's table. That night, when the biscuits were served, the lady wept. Not for their taste, they were no sweeter than sin, but for the memory they stirred, summers in her mother's orchard, when plums dropped warm into her palm, and the world tasted of sunshine. Above the chapel altar, a tapestry fluttered where rats had chewed through its edge. Woven into its threads was the Last Supper, Christ reaching toward bread, his disciples leaning in eager reverence. Now the image stuttered in decay, the edges ragged and blurred. Beneath it, the congregation did not bow their heads. They did not reach for anything. The sacred gesture had lost its shape. Instead, they waiting for the next knock at the door, the next bargain in whispered Latin, the next bowl of soup that held the memory of soup. Up in the rafters, a bird stirred in the twilight. It cried once sharp, hollow, and urgent. Not a song, but a warning, its voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Heads turned, eyes met, chins lifted as if the animal's cry had knotted their hearts in a single moment of shared dread. Outside, the wind rose again like a dirge, threading between buttresses and across the empty square. It carried with it the promise of deeper frost. The river beyond the walls had frozen in places, its surface spanned by thin sheets of ice that creaked whenever stray carts or the occasional straggler passed. Those who still dared venture near the banks spoke of seeing fish gasping beneath. The ice-silvery corpses caught at the edge of life and death. And in the street, a mother sought her son. She called his name softly, voice ragged with terror. He had wandered to the stables, tempted by scraps rumored to linger in the hay. She thought to find him tucked into warmth. Instead, she discovered footprints that trailed off into darkness. The boy was not there, and the echoes of his small shoes on stone remained like a question without answer. In the guardhouse, the sentry lowered the tongue from his mouth at last, his jaw working the gritty salt. He stared at the city beyond the arrow slit, and for the first time he tasted hunger as something more than need. He tasted rage, fear, and something deep in his chest like regret. He pressed his hand to the slit, as though he could shield the city from what came next. But dawn, once pale as blood, would burn into noon. The sun would climb, casting light on each new act of barter, bones traded for wine, tears traded for crusts, the bones of memory traded for the bones of the living. The stables would fill again. The steward would open his ledger, the baron would sip his wine and claim righteousness. The girl would hammer more bread, and the chapel would echo with prayers that clung to the walls like soot, yet in the rafters. The bird would cry once more. That warning, carried on wings smaller than an arrow, but heavier than fate, would cut through the hollow hall and pierce every soul who heard it, because survival here was not merely living. It was listening. To the hunger in one's bones, listening to memory as curse, listening to the flight of a bird calling for change, and when its cry came again, the city would know the next chapter of its suffering had begun. Outline 7, word, count, 345. The fog never lifted. It clung to the city like old linen, damp and unforgiving, softening the edges of the towers and choking the lungs of the living. From the docks came the scent of brine and putrefaction, barrels of pickled herring split and spilling, their contents more gray than silver. A fisherman hauled a crate onto the quay, bones creaking louder than the planks. Inside were eels, some dead, some not, writhing in filth. A friar blessed them with trembling fingers, murmuring Latin not for salvation, but as a shield against the horror of need. He would trade the fish to the cloister for candles and a piece of beeswax to soothe his throat. In the back streets, a girl with a velvet ribbon tied around her wrist walked from door to door, offering salted lark's meat for old shoes. Her ribbon was the only color left in the world. No one asked where the lark had come from. The tavern's hearth had long since gone cold. The innkeeper sold cider pressed from rotten apples, its taste masked with cloves and wishful thinking. Patrons drank in silence, not for warmth or cheer, but for the pause between pangs. Above it all, in a turret wrapped in ivy and thyme, an old woman lit a fire using pages from a French manuscript. The words no longer mattered. What remained was the crackle, the glow, the smoke that curled up to the rafters like incense. She sipped broth made from bones she could not name and stared into the flames. Seeing faces of those long dead, outside the church bell told the hour. No one moved. They knew what the bell meant. Another day had passed. Another barter. Another plate scraped clean of gilt. In the window of the baker's ruined shop, a single crust lay on the sill, growing mold like lace. And still no one dared take it.